Hello and welcome to day 54. We are looking at Numbers chapters 12 and 13, Psalm 90, and Mark 2 today. We start by reading about how Moses is a quietly humble man and the first prophet for us to really be looking up to and emulating in our lives. Now, Aaron and Miriam, who are siblings of Moses, decide that they kind of like to get in on Moses' game with God, have the same kind of relationship, and get visions and messages from God to share with the people. So Aaron and Miriam are wanting what Moses has, but they are not behaving the way Moses did. Moses never asked for this role from God. Moses was humble and was a leader, a man after God's own heart, and so God selected Moses to do this work. Moses didn't put himself forward, and so God gets very angry with Aaron and Miriam, sets them aside. Miriam ends up sick and has to be set aside for 7 days as a consequence for their trying to take over part of what Moses is doing as a leader. Moses then sends some scouts into Canaan, the promised land, the land of milk and honey. And they go to check it out, and they are told to check out the people, the land, the towns, the soil, the forest, and the produce, what the land produces. They come back and report that there are giant people in the land. They are fierce people. It is very productive land, and they bring back some amazing grapes to show off. But they have strongly fortified cities. Almost all the scouts are like, yeah, this isn't going to work. We can't do this. Caleb and his friend Joshua, later we'll find out, stood by his side. But Caleb's like, oh no, we've got this. God's on our side. We can do this. But everyone's like, yeah, nah, this is not going to happen. Now, God had promised this land to the people. So the question is, where was their faith? God had just brought them all out of Egypt. God had been keeping them alive in the wilderness. And now they're like, oh, yeah, God could take on the Egyptian empire, could take on Pharaoh, but can't take on the people living in the area of Canaan. These are much smaller tribes and, nation state groups of people. I think the question for us to consider as we read this today is, where are we putting our faith? Are we trusting God to get us through whatever it is that's standing in front of us? Is there a risk that God is asking us to take that shows that we trust and obey God? And are we willing to step out with that? Or are we just kind of holding back, trying to keep things safe, kind of stay within our comfort bubbles? Um, so, what is the giant that you are facing in your life, and are you willing to step forward and take on that giant, trusting God will come through with you? In Psalm 90, we read about the psalmist asking God to be patient with us, that our lives are toil and trouble, and asking for God to teach us how to live well. So, the psalmist is comparing our short lives to God's eternity, and there's a request for God's compassion to make our lives joyful in the midst of some of the struggles that we are having to deal with. This psalm gives us beautiful image, not just of God the creator, but also this idea of God having given birth to the world. This is one of the places where we see some feminine imagery. Remember, we are all made in God's image, not just men, but men and women. And here is a place where we get some of that imagery of God giving birth to the world. Now, a quick note about numbers, and I don't mean the name of this book, but the actual digits that are sometimes referred to. The numbers 7 and 70 represent completion and perfection in the Hebrew tradition. 120 was considered an ideal length for life, and so Moses reached this. There are many people, many scholars who don't think he was exactly literally 120 years old when he died, but rather the number 120 shows that he lived the ideal life that we should all aspire to. Now, 120, even in that time, was considered a very unrealistic number to get to, even here in our time with the medical supplies that we have. We don't reach 120. 70 was a more realistic age to reach, and 70 was completion and perfection as well. And there were a fair number of people that reached 70. Of course, there were a lot of things that happened that stopped people from reaching 70, but it was a realistic number to be um, trying to achieve. Now, part of what the psalmist is talking about here is that we do need to turn or repent, return to God in our lives. And the English words turn and return in Hebrew, it's the same verb, it's the same word. They don't have two words meaning two different things. So turn for us is, to turn around from one direction to another direction. Return is you go someplace and then you come back. So to a certain extent, they are quite similar in English as well. But when you're reading in the Hebrew Bible where it says turn or return, you can think of those as being the same thing. And in both cases, sin has turned us away from God, and we need to return to God. We need to repent, turn around, come back to where God is in our lives. And the psalmist really believes that we can rejoice through God's help in our lives. As we're going through Mark, we see in this chapter that Jesus returns home from some of his teaching travels. A crowd hears that he's back and they gather at his house. The place is so packed that a paraplegic, someone who can't walk, was brought, and they had to climb up on the roof and open a place in the roof and lower the guy down in order to get him to Jesus. But his friends believed enough in Jesus that they wanted Jesus' healing for their friend. And so they did all this work to get him down through the roof. Jesus is impressed by this bold action and heals the guy. And I think the story here for us is, what bold action are we willing to take to come to Jesus, to seek healing, to seek redemption, to seek resolution to conflicts in our life, to make our lives better? Are we, again, just kind of going through the motions of our daily lives, staying in our comfort zones, or are we taking bold action to help someone that we know who is struggling? We hear about a tax collector, Levi, who's minding his own business, collecting taxes from his neighbors. But Jesus says, "Come follow me," and he drops what he's doing and he follows Jesus. Question for us from this story is, do we drop what we're doing to follow Jesus? How often are we doom scrolling through social media, sitting as couch potatoes and streaming stuff, playing video games for hours and hours and hours? Are we distracted by the things of this world, or are we following when Jesus calls us? Now, at one point, some of the religious authorities show up and they're complaining because Jesus is eating with a bunch of disreputable people, with misfits, with the people who have violated some rules or commandments or just don't fit in with the setup that the religious leaders have. And Jesus says that he came for the sin sick, not the spiritually healthy. As I reflected on this, I was thinking, okay, Jesus has come, Jesus taught his disciples then taught another generation of disciples, so on and so forth, until it comes to us today. Have we picked up the work of helping people who are sin sick, people who are struggling, people who are alone, people who don't fit in? Are we doing Jesus' work with people who need spiritual healing? And once again, I think many times we are just about keeping ourselves comfortable and having a pleasant life. And I think Jesus is really challenging us to figure out who are the people we need to reach out to and figure out a way to make them feel welcome and healthy in their spirit. We've got a couple more interesting little tidbits towards the end of this chapter. There's a brief part on fasting or feasting. The Jewish tradition had specific fasting days and fasting practices that were done as part of a worship practice of setting aside sinful things. So it was an offering. By our fast was an offering, saying, God, we are obedient and we are putting you first in our lives. Jesus points out that we don't fast at weddings. We feast at weddings when the bridegroom is there, when the party's going on. So while Jesus is with his followers, that's the wedding time. Jesus is the bridegroom. the church is the bride, and while he's with us, we're going to feast. But then he says the fasting will come later. And so at this point, there is a long Christian tradition of fasting, of having different time periods. The best known fast is during the season of Lent. But there's many types of fasting that different Christian traditions have done. Many individual Christians continue to fast in order to discern God's will and receive God's help in their lives, especially in the area of the Christian church in Africa. Today, I've known many Africans who regularly fast as part of their prayer practice in order to understand what God is calling for them in their life, or to be seeking physical or spiritual healing from God. Jesus then has a couple quick little phrases here about not matching old fabric with new, or putting new wine in old wineskins because they will burst. The Jewish religious authorities are telling Jesus, you're not doing things the right way, the way that we've been doing them for generations, going back to Moses. And Jesus is like, yeah, you know what? God gave you a certain set of instructions in the time of Moses to deal with a certain thing going on at that time. I am here before you right now, and I am giving you some new instructions. And it is time to do what I'm asking you to do and set aside some of the traditions of the past. I think this is one of the things that churches need to struggle with too, because how often are we trying to reach a new group of people, grow a new generation of believers, but trying to fit them into some of the traditions and some of the practices of a previous generation? At what point do we need to start a new worship service, start a new group, start a new ministry, start a new event where new people have a new opportunity to create a new group of relationships and friends where they feel they belong? It is really hard for new people to come into a group that's been together for 30, 40, 50 years, and they don't know the inside jokes, they don't know the history, they don't know the life turmoils that everyone has gone through, they don't know the stories. So how can we discern what times we need to start something new with a new group of people so that they feel like it is theirs and they have their own connection to God? Finally, we've got a little bit about Sabbath, and Jesus is saying that Sabbath is a gift that was given to serve us, to help us be healthy, to spend time in rest and relaxation, to spend time with God. The point is not that Sabbath rules us, but that Sabbath is a gift to us to be healthy. Now, I think these days we've gone too far in the opposite direction. The Pharisees were super legalistic about what you could and couldn't do on the Sabbath. And it was very rigid, and they were trying to be obedient, but they kind of gone too far, which we all like to do. We all like to get legalistic at times. But what Jesus is saying, we need to have some common sense. We need to have some compassion. The point is not to be rigid and perfect about the Sabbath, but the point is that every week we set aside a chunk of time to be with God. Every week we set aside a certain period of time where we are resting, where we are letting our body be renewed and restored. And I think that is a challenge for many of us these days. We live in a culture that's all about busyness and constantly going and constantly being scheduled and constantly have stuff going on. And I think this is the challenge that Jesus is still giving us. The Sabbath is still important. We do not need to be legalistic about it, but we do need to set aside time to be with God and to let our bodies rest. Have a super day. We'll see you next time.